Drones can produce some absolutely incredible footage, but if you use the wrong settings, you won't be able to get professional quality footage with your drone. So in this video, I'm going to show you 10 essential settings that you need to know to shoot professional cinematic videos with any drone. These will apply to any DJI drone and even camera drones from other brands. So let's dive right in. Setting number 1 is exposure. Now you might think this is kind of basic, but it's absolutely essential for good drone shots. A lot of beginners just leave the exposure on auto, but that's not a good idea because you have no control over what settings the drone decides to use, and believe me, it gets them wrong sometimes. Also in auto mode, the exposure or brightness can change during a shot, which doesn't look great. So we'll want to set our exposure settings manually. So the very first thing you'll want to do is to switch from auto mode to pro mode so that we have control over the camera settings. And there are two main exposure settings we need to pay attention to: shutter speed and ISO. By default in the DJI Fly app, these will both be set to auto, and you can switch them to manual control by tapping on auto next to both shutter speed and ISO. You'll want to have your ISO set as low as possible. I keep it set to ISO 100 90% of the time. In low light, you will have to bump this up to get a bright enough image, but the higher you go, the worse the quality gets and the more noise and graininess you have. How high you can set the ISO and still get decent quality depends on what drone you're using. On some drones, it starts to totally fall apart at ISO 400, whereas on other drones, you can go all the way on up to ISO 1600 or even higher and still get decent results. So you'll just have to test out how high you can go in low light and still get decent results with your drone. Next, you'll want to use the shutter speed to adjust the brightness of your shot. Now, ideally, we want to follow what's called the 180-degree shutter rule and set the shutter speed to double the frame rate. So for 30 frames per second, that would be 1/60th of a second, because it gives you the most natural motion blur and makes your shots look much smoother. But most of the time, if you set your shutter speed this low, your footage will be way too bright. So to fix that, you'll need to use ND filters, which attach to the camera and cut down the amount of light that comes in. Now, even if you can't set the shutter speed to exactly double the frame rate, you can still get great shots. You'll just want to be aware that in bright light, you won't be getting proper motion blur. When the 180-degree shutter rule makes the most difference is when there's a lot of motion in your shot. For example, if you're flying low and fast or tracking a subject. If you're just flying at 400 feet filming a landscape, chances are there won't be any motion that's actually fast enough to be blurred with a lower shutter speed anyway. Now, is it essential to always use the 180-degree shutter rule? No, not really. If you do use it, it will get you better shots, especially if there is a lot of motion in your shot. But to be completely honest, for quick shots, I sometimes don't want to mess around with ND filters, and I'll just shoot with a higher shutter speed, and then I'll just add fake motion blur in post. But for best results, use an ND filter and 180-degree shutter speed. And I've made a PDF checklist of all the settings in this video, so make sure to check that out. I'll put a link in the description where you can download it completely for free. Essential setting number 2 is white balance, which is basically how warm or cool the shot is. You'll find this setting in DJI Fly under the second tab of the camera settings box. Now, you could just leave it to auto and it will do a decent job a lot of the time, but in auto mode, the white balance can change during a shot and sometimes it just simply gets it wrong. So again, I'd recommend that you turn off auto and set the white balance manually. If it's sunny, you'll want to set the white balance to around 5600 Kelvin. If it's cloudy, you'll want it on up around 6300 Kelvin. And at sunrise and sunset, I like to have it around 5600 or a little bit higher to make sure I get the nice and warm colors. And sometimes if I want to set the white balance very quickly, I'll just click auto and let it set it, and then click it back to manual to lock it in, and often that will look decent without any extra adjustment. Essential drone setting number 3 is resolution. You'll want to set the resolution as high as possible. On most drones, that will be 4K. Some have 5K or 5 point something K options. Some of the older drones might be only 2.7K, but whatever the highest resolution option is, that's what you'll generally want to go for. There's really no benefit to using a lower resolution except smaller file sizes, and if you want the best quality video, the bigger files are definitely worth the jump in quality that you get by shooting at the highest resolution. If you want to shoot vertical video, some drones will let you flip the entire camera to vertical, so you can use the entire area of the sensor for vertical videos. And on many drones that can't do that, there's a 2.7K vertical mode that uses the full height of their 4x3 sensor instead of just cropping into 16:9 in post. And so if your drone has that, you'll want to use it. Setting number 4 is frame rate. A lot of people wonder, what frame rate should I shoot in with my drone? 24 frames per second is considered the most cinematic, but unless you strictly follow the 180-degree shutter rule and always use a 1/50th of a second shutter speed, your 24 frames per second footage will end up looking jittery and not smooth, so in general I'd recommend sticking to 30 frames per second as your basic frame rate. If your drone lets you shoot at 60 frames per second in the highest resolution, you can set it to 60 frames per second for any situations where you might want to slow the footage down. I actually end up shooting at 60 frames per second a lot of the time, even though I edit on a 30 frames per second timeline, so I always have the option to slow the footage down to half speed if I want to. And if you really want to slow things down, on a lot of drones you can switch over into a dedicated slow motion mode and shoot at an even higher frame rate, somewhere between 100 frames per second on up to 240 frames per second. If you can only shoot full HD slow motion, it's usually not good enough quality that I'd personally actually use it. If there's an option for 4K at 100 frames per second or 120 frames per second though, that is usually pretty good quality and can give you some amazing results if you can find something that actually looks cool slowed down. Don't just film landscapes in 120 frames per second, that will look extremely boring. Find some kind of fast action like sports or wildlife or flowing water, or something that looks good slowed down, otherwise you're just wasting card space with the higher frame rate. Setting number 5 is color profile. This is how the drone processes the image that's coming from the camera sensor before writing it to the SD card. First of all, there's normal color profile, which adds a lot of contrast and saturation to the footage, and then there's D-Log M, which has a lot less contrast and saturation, but it retains a lot more color grading flexibility and more dynamic range, which is how dark and bright parts of the shot you can see at the same time. And then finally, there's hybrid log gamma, or HLG for short, which is somewhere in between the two. I basically always use either D-Log M or hybrid log gamma color profiles because it all in all gives much better quality results. Now, normal color profile on newer drones like the Air 3S has actually gotten a lot better, but for professional results, shooting in D-Log or hybrid log gamma is still the way to go. Now, both hybrid log gamma and D-Log M will need to be color graded to look good, and even normal color profile will benefit a lot from color grading, so if you want to learn how to color grade your footage, I'll link a video in the description where I explain how I color grade my drone shots. Moving on to setting number 6, which is zoom. Now, a lot of drones like the DJI Mini series and the DJI Flip only have one wide angle camera and only have digital zoom, and on these drones you don't want to ever zoom in because it will massively degrade the image quality, since it's just digital zoom that's basically just cropping into the image. But for drones like the Air 3S and Mavic 3 line that have more than one camera, you can choose between wide angle and telephoto cameras. And which of these cameras you should use depends on what type of shot you want to get. The wide angle camera is great for getting typical drone shots, whereas the telecamera is great for isolating a subject, and it makes the background appear a lot larger in relation to the subject and really accentuates parallax, all of which can make your shots look a lot more grand and epic. So usually you'll want to shoot a mix of shots from the wide angle camera and telecamera so that you have some variety in your clips and have more options when you're editing your video together. And even if you have multiple cameras, one thing to keep in mind is that you want to just switch between those different cameras, those different focal lengths, and not try to use digital zoom somewhere in between, because again, it will massively degrade the image quality. And moving on to setting number 7, which is gain and expo tuning settings. These settings modify how the drone responds to your stick inputs in Cine, normal, and sport modes, and they're super important for getting the smoothest shots. And to change these settings, we'll go into the settings menu and go to control and then gain and expo tuning settings. Now for Cine mode, I just leave all the settings at the default. I don't really use Cine mode that much, and for when I do, the default settings are fine. Now in normal mode, I have max horizontal ascent and descent speeds all set to the max angular velocity, which is how fast the drone turns left and right, set to 75 degrees a second, yaw smoothness set at 15, and braking at 100. And the expo settings I set at 0.25 for up and down, 0.15 for yaw, and 0.15 for pitch and roll. And then under gimbal, I have max tilt speed set to 15 degrees per second, and smoothness set to 10. And then for sport mode, the max horizontal ascent and descent speeds are all at the max, and then max angular velocity is set to 120 degrees per second, and yaw smoothness is set to 12, and brake sensitivity is again at 100. Then under expo, up and down is set to 0.3, yaw is set to 0.15, and pitch roll is set to 0.25. And under gimbal, max speed is at 20 degrees per second, and smoothness is at 15. Now, these aren't the only settings that can work well. You can do testing with your own drone and figure out what settings work best for how you fly, but these are the settings I found give the best results for me. And if you want to learn how to get cinematic moves with your drone, I'll leave a link to my top 10 drone moves in the description as well. Setting number 8 is turning on the histogram, which helps you judge your exposure. A lot of people are kind of intimidated when they see the histogram, but it's actually pretty simple. To turn it on, you'll just go to settings, camera, and then toggle the histogram on, and a little floating box with little peaks will come up in the camera feed. The right side of the histogram is your highlights and the left side is the shadows. In the middle is your midtones, and top to bottom is how much of your image is that brightness. In short, you want to have the mountain of data sitting basically in the middle of the histogram, which means that you aren't losing data in either the highlights or the shadows. If you have the mountain of data all bunched up onto the right side, it means that your exposure is too bright, and if it's all bunched up on the left, it means that it's too dark. Essential setting number 9 is grid lines and center marker. Again, you'll find this under the camera tab in settings, and the grid line and center marker are extremely helpful for composing your shots. First of all, the thirds grid lines help you compose your shots according to the rule of thirds, which is basically that you split the shot in thirds horizontally and vertically, and you want to put the important parts of the image, like the horizon or a subject, on one of those horizontal or vertical thirds lines, or where the horizontal and vertical thirds lines cross. For example, it often works well to put the horizon on the top thirds line if you want to emphasize the ground, or on the bottom thirds line if you want to emphasize the sky. So make sure to turn on your thirds grid lines to help with composition. And then the center marker is helpful if you want to precisely center something in the frame, or even if you just want to see exactly where you're headed. And finally, essential drone setting number 10 is sharpness and noise reduction. You can get quite good results by leaving these settings to the default of 0 for both sharpness and noise reduction, but DJI drones tend to be a bit over aggressive with their sharpening and noise reduction, so especially in low light, you start to lose a lot of detail. So in general, I'd recommend setting both sharpening and noise reduction to -1. In general, I find this gives you a happy medium between over aggressive processing in the drone and having to do too much work in post to get rid of the noise and sharpen the footage. So there you have all of my essential settings to shoot cinematic drone videos. If you'd like to see more tutorials like this, check out the Flying Filmmaker course, where I have over 70 tutorials showing in depth how I film cinematic drone shots, edit them together into engaging videos, color grade my footage to give it the cinematic look, and more. And you can check that out at flyingfilmmakerpro.com, or if you aren't ready to dive into the full course, I have a completely free training where I share my top 10 secrets to cinematic drone shots. And of course, links to everything will be in the description. And finally, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.